Was Paul's Dead partially inspired by a real-life motorbike accident? Along with numerous sources close to the Beatles, their manager Brian Epstein confirmed there was an accident involving McCartney, and it happened in December 1965. Last mid-December, Paul injured his lip and chipped his tooth in the moped accident. Paul McCartney likewise confirmed there was an accident in several quotes over the years. Furthermore, he revealed he was with friend and Guinness heir Tara Brown, who would be killed 1 year later in a car accident. McCartney and others have cited this fatal crash to be the lyrical inspiration for A Day in a Life. He blew his mind out in a car. He didn't notice that the lights had changed. Here are some quotes from Paul taken from an interview for 2000's The Beatles Anthology book, in which he goes into detail about his fateful moped accident. I had an accident when I came off a moped in Wirral, near Liverpool. I had a very good friend who lived in London called Tara Brown, a Guinness heir. There I was, chipped tooth and all. The pavement came through my lip and split it. It was also this moped accident that led to Paul growing his mustache and inspiring the band's Sgt. Pepper look. In fact, that was why I started to grow a mustache. It caught on with the guys in the group. If one of us did something like growing his hair long and we liked the idea, we'd all tend to do it. And then it became seen as a kind of revolutionary idea that young men of our age definitely ought to grow a mustache. And it all fell in with the Sgt. Pepper thing, because he had a droopy mustache. There are photos from this period in question in which you can see Paul's chipped tooth and the paperback writer and Rain promotional clips. This is photographic evidence of the accident months prior to the recording of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. This timeline is important since it's with Sgt. Pepper that the more credible Paul's Dead clues start to appear. It's not a logical stretch to suggest that this real-life accident played an inspirational role in the Beatles creating a secret and fictional narrative in which Paul was killed in an accident. Add to the fact that Paul was with a friend who later died in a car crash during the early recording sessions of Sgt. Pepper, and it's clear that the Beatles were contemplating death in motor vehicle accidents. And this preoccupation found its way in both the lyrics and various Paul's Dead clues fans would later discover. In addition to real-life events causing the Beatles to contemplate death, they were all experimenting with LSD at the time, which itself causes the user to face their own mortality, especially while they're in the process of coming down. This is echoed by John Lennon's lyrics to She Said, in which he famously made use of something Peter Fonda told him while they were tripping together in Los Angeles. I know what it's like to be dead. So the Beatles were doing acid and thinking about death. In addition to these two contributing elements, there was a third source of inspiration that would provide much of the imagery and stylistic techniques employed in the Paul's Dead narrative. Author Lewis Carroll. One of the reasons why Paul's Dead has never gained any credibility with the general public, Beatles fans, or music historians is because of a fundamental lack of cohesion and structure in the Paul's Dead clues. Without the understanding necessary to draw all the elements of the death clues together, it's easy to reject them. The link between all the clues, the Rosetta Stone of Paul's Dead, is found in the connection between the Beatles and author Lewis Carroll of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and its sequel, Through the Looking Glass, and what Alice found there. On the cover of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, the band are accompanied by several cardboard cutouts of notable people. One of these people is Lewis Carroll. Speaking to the BBC in 1965, John Lennon declared his love for Alice in Wonderland and Alice Through the Looking Glass, revealing, I usually read those two about once a year because I still like them. Lennon's childhood was filled with puns, wordplay, and double meanings that turned every phrase or offhanded comment into a creative game. At school, John would impress students and teachers alike by an awareness and intellect that seemed out of place for such a young man. In high school, John started an underground newspaper by the name of The Daily How. It contained numerous drawings and satirical writings by the young Lennon, who wrote under the pen name of Dr. Winston O'Boogie. Although John's grades were never up to snuff, he showed so much potential and creativity that a teacher of his was able to get him a spot at the Liverpool College of Art. Once there, he impressed the faculty with his knowledge of many artistic techniques: abstraction, surrealism, collage, and montage. Many of these techniques would come into play during the Beatles' mid-60s psychedelic period. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band is credited with being, among other things, the soundtrack to the 1967 Summer of Love. Although Sgt. Pepper is viewed as largely being a McCartney brainchild, it contains some of John's most groundbreaking work as a surrealistic poet. It's also where the Lewis Carroll influence comes to the foreground, especially with the track Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. The lyrics are directly inspired by the Wool and Water chapter of Through the Looking Glass, in which Alice and a sheep magically find themselves floating downstream in a small rowboat. Picture yourself in a boat on a river with Flex. Alice found they were in a little boat gliding between the banks. In the official 1997 biography, Paul McCartney, many years from now, when McCartney was asked about the origins of Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, he said the following. John had the title and he had the first. It started off very Alice in Wonderland. Picture yourself in a boat on the river. It's very Alice. Both of us had read the Alice books and always referred to them. We were always talking about Jabberwocky, and we knew those more than any other books really. And when psychedelics came in, the heady quality of them was perfect. It was an Alice thing, which both of us loved. Many people associate Lewis Carroll with Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, although the Beatles' primary source for inspiration is the follow-up, Through the Looking Glass. In the first chapter of Looking Glass, Alice is in the study playing chess with her kitty when she stares at the large mirror above the fireplace. Alice climbs up on the mantel and steps through the mirror, or what was commonly called at the time, the looking glass. She emerges on the other side of the mirror and finds chess pieces talking among themselves in the ashes of the fireplace. After listening to the chess pieces for a few moments, she takes notice of a book lying on the table. Alice looks down on the writing in the book, and although she sees words and letters there, she can't quite read it. She puzzles over this for some time, but at last a thought strikes her. Why, it's a looking glass book, of course, and if I hold it up to the glass, the words will all go the right way again. Alice places the text up to the mirror and is finally able to read the words. However, even in the right direction, it's still too abstract and ambiguous for her to completely make sense of. Her reaction after reading what turns out to be a poem entitled Jabberwocky is morbid. Somehow it seems to fill my head with ideas, only I don't know exactly what they are. However, somebody killed something. Those familiar with the poem know that the Jabberwocky is actually a monstrous beast beheaded by a hero and his vorpal sword. The poem's impact on Alice's story doesn't end with the first chapter. The Jabberwocky poem becomes the ultimate object for interpretation in Alice's second adventure, a piece of art that is mysterious and reluctant to divulge any secrets that could lead to its true meaning. And the poem is not presented as purely nonsensical. Alice knows that it has a purpose and narrative, and she is absolutely certain that somebody or something dies at the end. What Paul's Dead enthusiasts underestimate more than anything else is the Lewis Carroll connection. When one considers John and Paul's noted affinity for the Alice books and the Carrillian nature of Paul's Dead clues, backwards messages, mirror tricks, decapitations, etc., it becomes apparent the Beatles were constructing their own Jabberwocky, a cryptic narrative embedded within the larger narrative of their albums and songs, and one that had attuned Beatle fans playing the role of Alice. In the previously cited 1997 biography, McCartney elaborated on the profound influence Lewis Carroll, and specifically the Jabberwocky, had on Lennon's work. John was a big Lewis Carroll fan, which I was too. In my view, two of John's great songs, Strawberry Fields and I Am the Walrus, both come from Jabberwocky. It's thanks to Jabberwocky that he could do that. Discovered by Paul's Dead historian R. Gary Patterson, one of the most credible and important clues is the Sgt. Pepper drum. By placing a straight-edge mirror horizontal and in the center of the drum skin at the words Lonely Hearts, a cryptic message appears. IX he die, or 11-9 he die. The arrow points directly to McCartney, and Patterson and others believe the numbers indicate the date of Paul's supposed demise. November, the 11th month, and 9, the 9th day. Now, November 9th is neither the date of Paul's moped accident or their friend Tara Brown's fatal car crash. Interestingly enough, according to John Lennon and Yoko Ono, November 9th, 1966 is a date they first met at the Indica Art Gallery in London. John Lennon had a well-documented obsession with the number 9, due to his birth date being October 9. And he no doubt placed great significance in meeting Yoko on that day. Could John have predicted that this meeting with his future romantic and creative partner, Yoko Ono, marked a symbolic death for his then songwriting partner, Paul McCartney? Or was it that the psychic waves of the LSD Lennon was riding at the time resulted in subconscious musings? Is Yoko my future and Paul my past? The alleged date in the drum clue notwithstanding, one thing is vividly clear: the words "he die" and an arrow pointing directly at Paul. Considering the Jabberwocky itself is discovered via a mirror trick in Through the Looking Glass, is it so far-fetched the Beatles would follow suit with their own clues? Furthermore, the infamous backwards messages, often cited by Paul's Dead enthusiasts, are audio mirror tricks akin to the Jabberwocky. Only when reversed can we hear their true meaning. Also in Through the Looking Glass, Alice encounters the White Queen, who lives her life in a backward state. "I don't understand you," said Alice. "It's dreadfully confusing." "That's the effect of living backwards," the Queen said kindly. Fittingly, the two most cited backwards messages, in connection to Paul's Dead, are both found on the White Album. Reflective of the White Queen, the first acts as a segue between John's "I'm So Tired" and Paul's "Blackbird." When the backwards gibberish is reversed, it sounds eerily like "Paul is a dead man, miss him, miss him, miss him." The second case of backmasking occurs in one of the most cryptic and controversial Beatles recordings ever, Revolution 9. When played backwards, the repeat at number 9 does sound an awful lot like "Turn me on, dead man." Between the day in the life lyric, "I'd love to turn you on," the other deathly clues, and Lennon's obsession with his birthday, it would make sense that this mysterious and foreboding sound collage would itself be part of the Beatles' Jabberwocky. In many ways, Revolution 9 acts as a climactic abstraction in answer to A Day in the Life, both epic finales to their respective albums. A Day in the Life suggests a darker narrative amid its surreal lyrics and is the culmination of the Beatles' pop song as art approach. Whereas Revolution 9 is pure and unadulterated sonics, orchestrated to put the listener into a trance. Stripping down all pretense of formal pop structure, it exists as the Jabberwocky existed, a piece of art that is mysterious and reluctant to divulge any secrets that could lead to its true meaning. Also, like the Jabberwocky, it is seemingly nonsensical on the surface, but through audio mirror tricks, some of its ideas and narrative crystallize. A riddle wrapped in a poem, wrapped in a storybook. Death clues wrapped in songs and artwork wrapped in an album. But despite all of the Carillion illusions and parlor games contained in Sgt. Pepper and the White Album, nowhere is the Beatles' Looking Glass world more evident than Magical Mystery Tour. Between the songs, film, and accompanying storybook, this is the nucleus of the Beatles' secret narrative. And within this centerpiece is another centerpiece: I Am the Walrus. There is a poem in Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass entitled "The Walrus and the Carpenter," which is read to Alice by Tweedledee and Tweedledum, another narrative within a narrative. In the poem, the walrus entreats a gullible bunch of oysters to join him on a nice stroll along the beach. The oysters realize far too late that the walrus had been playing a trick on them. Once they are led far enough away, he devours them. The parallel is that Beatles fans, oyster-like, follow John, the declared walrus, and are tricked by the Paul's Dead Jabberwocky. Despite the obvious inspiration the Walrus and the Carpenter had on I Am the Walrus, namely its central and tusked protagonist, there are multiple allusions to the poem and Through the Looking Glass in its lyrics. Lennon sings the refrain, "I'm crying," 5 times. The Walrus in Carroll's poem cries as well. The Walrus, feeling sorry for playing such a nefarious trick on the oysters, begins to sob, even as he continues to eat them. "I weep for you," the Walrus said. "I deeply sympathize." With sobs and tears, he sorted out those of the largest size, holding his pocket handkerchief before his streaming eyes. The declaration of "I am the Eggman" is a reference to Humpty Dumpty. This notable Eggman is the subject of a popular English nursery rhyme, and he's also a character in Through the Looking Glass. In fact, Carroll and his illustrator, John Tennell, helped to popularize the image of Humpty Dumpty as an egg. In an illustration in the 1877 Mother Goose nursery rhyme collection, Humpty is depicted as a small boy. Humpty's role in Through the Looking Glass should raise more than a few eyebrows. The Eggman helps Alice to decipher part of the Jabberwocky poem and the cryptic words contained therein. So Lennon declaring "I am the Eggman" is yet another thing pointing us to Through the Looking Glass and the Jabberwocky. Like many of the characters Alice encounters in the Looking Glass world, there is a dark cloud hanging over Humpty's head. As Alice converses with the Eggman, she has the following impression: If he, Humpty Dumpty, smiled much more, the ends of his mouth might meet behind, she thought, and then I don't know what would happen to his head. I'm afraid it would come off. As mentioned, the Jabberwocky is likewise beheaded. Also, Alice and other characters are continually threatened with decapitation by the Queen of Hearts in Wonderland. There's more talk of heads being cut off in Looking Glass, thanks to Tweedledee and Tweedledum. Tweedledum arranged a bolster around the neck of Tweedledee to keep his head from being cut off, as he said. You know, he added very gravely, it's one of the most serious things that can possibly happen to one in battle, to get one's head cut off. This beheading motif in Carroll's Alice books are reflected in numerous Paul's Dead clues that suggest McCartney was a victim of a decapitation, or at very least severe head wounds via several lyrics, a crack in cartoon Paul's head, and the beheading of the magical mystical boy, revealed and analyzed in part 1 of this video series. Even apart from the Alice books, in the classic Mother Goose tragedy, Humpty Dumpty fell from a wall and cracked his head so badly that all the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty Dumpty together again. With this in mind, the old nursery rhyme can be reinterpreted through the lens of the Paul's Dead narrative. Humpty Dumpty, Paul, sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty, Paul, had a great fall, accident. All the king's horses, ambulance, and all the king's men, doctors, couldn't put Humpty, Paul, together again. I Am the Walrus also contains allusions to James Joyce and his novel Finnegan's Wake. Humpty Dumpty figures prominently in a poem contained within Joyce's novel, yet another narrative within a narrative. And parts of Humpty's name, whether it be the umped or the dumped or a variation thereof, as in Humpta, Tumtos, are scattered throughout the work. Like Carroll, Joyce was another one of Lennon's influences, so it's likely Finnegan's Wake also played a role in the Beatles Jabberwocky. The first 2 chapters of Finnegan's Wake loosely follow the plot of the Irish drinking song Finnegan's Wake. In the first 2 chapters, the protagonist, alternately called Tim Finnegan, or Finn, or Finningmore, or Mr. Fun, is believed to have died from a fall and is given a premature funeral. While in his coffin, an imposter arrives to take his place. Like Finnegan, the imposter has several monikers, including his nickname, Here Comes Everybody. Furthermore, in Finnegan's Wake, the phrase Goo Goo Goose appears, and this is possibly reflective of Goo Goo Gajoob. The walrus is also evoked in Finnegan's Wake via the following phrases: Walla Hasmagagadad, Walrus Power, and Walrus. Joyce interpreted Humpty Dumpty, aka the Eggman, as life, the egg being a natural symbol of birth, and the walrus as a symbol of death, devourer of oysters in Carroll's poem. This also works perfectly with I Am the Walrus and the Paul's Dead narrative. In the annotated Alice, Lewis Carroll historian Martin Gardner reveals an important link between James Joyce and Lewis Carroll. In English literature, the great master of the portmanteau word is, of course, James Joyce. Finnegan's Wake, like the Alice books, A Dream, contains them by the tens of thousands. This includes those 1,000-letter thunderclaps that symbolize, among other things, the mighty fall from his ladder of Tim Finnegan. Humpty Dumpty himself is packed up in the 7th thunderclap. A portmanteau word is one of Lewis Carroll's literary innovations, a product of combining 2 related words to form a third new word. The combination of trip and fall would become trawl. The combination of snort and chuckle would become chortle, and so on. In addition to being adopted by James Joyce, John Lennon likewise created portmanteau words, and a couple appear in I Am the Walrus, Crabalocker and Texpert. The Jabberwocky poem also contained portmanteau words that Humpty Dumpty deciphers for Alice. While slithy means life and slimy, life is the same as active. You see, it's like a portmanteau. There are 2 meanings packed up into one word. Humpty Dumpty also explains to Alice his preference for manipulating words to serve his own purposes, much like Lewis Carroll, James Joyce, and John Lennon. When I use a word, Humpty Dumpty said, in a rather scornful tone, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. The question is, said Alice, whether you can make words mean so many different things. The question is, said Humpty Dumpty, which is to be master. That's all. Another important reference in I Am the Walrus is Edgar Allan Poe. Man, you should have seen them kicking Edgar Allan Poe. Few literary figures before or since have conjured up more dark images and mystery. Poe, like Lennon, was a master of wordplay who occasionally left secret messages scattered throughout his short stories for readers to unearth, study, and decipher. Poe, like Lewis Carroll, was also featured on the cover of Sgt. Pepper. The most memorable story in which Poe used secret messages was The Gold Bug. In this story, Poe introduces his readers to the world of cryptography, the study of cryptographs or seemingly random numbers, letters, or symbols that, when used with a cipher, a sort of grammatical key, become words. This is also important because it creates a Lennon-Poe-Carroll connection based on words, mystery, hidden messages, and death. In addition to Joyce and Poe references, the fade out of I Am the Walrus contains an end snippet from William Shakespeare's King Lear. When asked about the inclusion of these lines, Lennon said that he just fed whatever lines were recited on a BBC radio production into the track. This would require no further examination if what he fed into the song was a commercial for soap or a local news broadcast. But the lines that are used from this play and the story of the play itself cast an ominous shadow on the track that renders Lennon's claim suspect. First and foremost, like most of Shakespeare's plays, King Lear is filled with death, greed, and deception. There's also a subplot of King Lear that intersects perfectly with Joyce's Finnegan's Wake, the idea of an imposter. In Shakespeare's play, the Earl of Gloucester was deceived by his illegitimate son Edmund into believing that he was actually Edgar, the other son of Gloucester. Edgar, as a result, is disinherited, leaving Edmund all the riches that the state of Gloucester has to offer. Even without back knowledge of the play, the King Lear passage, selected for the finale of I Am the Walrus, contains such deftly phrases that one should grow suspicious from the following lines alone. Thou hast slain me, bury my body. Oh, untimely death. And what? Is he dead? During the song's fade out, there is a chant of gibberish. Oompa, oompa, stick it up your joompa. Many hippies are convinced that the chant is smoke pot, everybody smoke pot. But when the gibberish is played backwards, it sounds more like ha ha, Paul's dead, ha ha, Paul's dead. Is this what the Walrus has been leading us to all along? And why did Lennon sing the Walrus was Paul in Glass Onion? Was it a red herring or plot twist in the Beatles' mystery, their Jabberwocky? Or is the question itself the core of the riddle? Judging from the song itself, I Am the Walrus, it would appear obvious that John was the Walrus. After all, he wrote and sang the song. However, within the Magical Mystery Tour's inner sleeve track listing, underneath I Am the Walrus, is the following strange message. No, you're not, said Little Nicola. Little Nicola is one of the passengers in the film who spent some time with Lennon. What made her think John wasn't the Walrus, and was this connected to a greater mystery? The plot thickens with the White Album in the track Glass Onion. In it, John addresses the listener. Well, here's another clue for you all. The Walrus was Paul. This song's significance is twofold. Apart from causing a conflict over who is truly the Walrus, the song is also evidence that the Beatles were involved in some kind of mystery that needed a clue to be solved. John himself later confirmed he was the one in the Walrus costume, and the lyric was just a crumb thrown to Paul because he was planning on splitting up their partnership and felt guilty about it. Here's his quote about the song and lyric from his 1980 Playboy interview. That line was a joke, you know. That line was put in partially because I was feeling guilty because I was with Yoko, and I knew I was finally high and dry. In a perverse way, I was sort of saying to Paul, here, have this crumb, have this illusion, have this stroke, because I'm leaving you. Quite frankly, Lennon's assertion doesn't make a lot of sense. First, he states the line as a joke, but then he tries to make out like it was some guilt-ridden tribute to Paul. Disregarding the fact that Lennon would go on to record 2 more albums with McCartney after the White Album, it's not clear how appointing Paul Walrus status serves as a tribute, although this interestingly links up with the 11/9 he died clue as a deeper, possibly subconscious motivation. Regardless, Lennon's quote doesn't address the fact that the lyric is directed at the listener and is presented as another clue for you all. There's also the following Lennon quote contained in the Beatles anthology, which is often cited. I threw the line in, the Walrus was Paul, just to confuse everybody a bit more. It could have been the Fox Terrier as Paul. I mean, it's just a bit of poetry. I was having a laugh because there'd been so much gobbledygook about Pepper, play it backwards and you stand on your head, and all that. Okay, so first the lyric is a joke, then an abstruse tribute to Paul, and now it's just a bit of poetry to confuse everybody. In his post-Beatles quotes, Lennon is generally glib about the Beatles' work and dismissive of people reading too much into his lyrics from his surrealistic period. However, take note of what Lennon said during a 1967 radio show while introducing I Am the Walrus to listeners. And now we're going to play a track from Magical Mystery Tour, which is one of my favorite albums because it's so weird. And I Am the Walrus is one of my favorite tracks because I did it, of course, but also because it's one of those that has enough little bitties going to keep you interested even 100 years later. If Lennon was actually just messing with fans who looked too deeply into the Beatles' music, then why in 1967 would he encourage people to find the little bitties contained within? Also, to return to Lennon's quote about Glass Onion, Lennon's claim that he could have just as easily have written The Fox Terrier Was Paul is a moot point at best. He didn't write The Fox Terrier Was Paul. He wrote The Walrus Was Paul. And the fact that he sung I Am the Walrus no doubt was going to raise questions. Both of Lennon's quotes regarding Glass Onion conveniently ignore the line, "Well, here's another clue for you all," and its implication. They also both ignore the little Nicola "No You're Not" subscript in the Mystery Tour inner sleeve. This alone proves Lennon wasn't telling the full truth about the Glass Onion lyric, if not outrightly lying. 1 year prior to Glass Onion, the Beatles created doubt about the Walrus' identity via the little Nicola subscript. In addition, in the Mystery Tour storybook, there's a cartoon illustration of the Walrus wearing John's granny glasses. And during the performance of the song in the film, there are moments where you see Ringo, in the chicken costume, wearing John's glasses. Obviously, the Beatles were creating some kind of mystery involving the identity of these animal creatures, with the Walrus being at the center of the mystery. This was, after all, a magical mystery tour. The fact that 1 year later, on the subsequent album, John gave us another clue about the Walrus' true identity should make it clear that the Beatles were still perpetrating this mystery, and deliberately so. Despite many Paul's Dead seekers subscribing to the Walrus Was Paul, there is far more evidence suggesting that John was indeed the tusked one. Yes, there is the little Nicola quote and the Glass Onion lyric, but the Walrus pendulum still swings in John's favor. First, John proclaims, "I am the Walrus," in the song, "I Am the Walrus." Secondly, in his song God, from Plastic Ono Band, there is the line, "I was the Walrus." Although it's clear that John wanted people to think the Walrus could be Paul between 1967 and 1970, he still made it a point to construct lyrical bookmarks that informed people that he was the Walrus all along. Confirming this Walrus was John theory is the performance of the song in the Mystery Tour film. John is presented as the Walrus, and Paul, the blood-splattered hippo, as discussed in the first video of this series. Not surprising, the hippo derives from the same source as the Walrus. In Chapter 9 of Through the Looking Glass, the White Queen and Red Queen are talking to Alice about a severe thunderstorm that took place last Tuesday. On that same Tuesday, the White Queen recalls Humpty Dumpty coming to the door with a corkscrew in his hand. The following words are exchanged. "What did he want?" said the Red Queen. "He said he would come in," the White Queen went on, "because he was looking for a hippopotamus." The White Queen reveals there was no hippopotamus in the home that day. What's important in this exchange is the mention of a hippopotamus in Looking Glass, and the fact that it's Humpty Dumpty, the Eggman himself, who is looking for one. And to up the ante higher, Humpty Dumpty is looking for the hippopotamus on a Tuesday, a tumultuous Tuesday at that. The Tuesday reference in conjunction with the hippopotamus is notable because of the following I Am the Walrus lyric, "Stupid Bloody Tuesday." And the only animal that appears to be even remotely bloody in the I Am the Walrus performance is the hippo. And if Paul was the Beatle that got into the grisly accident and played bass, it's only logical to conclude that once and for all, the hippo was Paul, and the Walrus was John. Also, in various shots of the I Am the Walrus performance, the Beatles are shown sitting on a great wall, much like Humpty Dumpty. This should prove that John was not simply throwing words around when he wrote I Am the Eggman. At the end of the segment, the Walrus with the other Beatles/animals right behind are shown leading a trail of people, oyster/eggmen, away from the camera and towards the slowly moving Mystery Tour bus. This should conjure up images of Lewis Carroll's poem, The Walrus and the Carpenter. Specifically, the Walrus leading the oysters down the beach. While this is happening, the outro of I Am the Walrus plays. As stated before, the outro, when played backwards, sounds a lot like "Ha ha, Paul's dead." With that in mind, are these oysters being led down the Paul's dead path by the Walrus? At the same time the Walrus is leading the others down the trail, there is footage superimposed in the upper left corner of the screen. The first image is that of flames, looking like the aftermath of an explosion, which again could harken back to Paul's dreadful car wreck. The first image after the flames is that of John Lennon. He is smacking his lips and appears to be eating. After this, there are images of the other passengers on the bus eating and licking their lips. There's a succession of faces chewing and smiling slyly. Undoubtedly, these feasting faces above a walrus leading white-clad men are a clear parallel to the walrus and the carpenter. At the end, John is shown again, still chewing. John greedily gorges himself in the same manner as Carroll's walrus. And John is the first and last person shown in the images. He is also the only Beatle. He is the leader. He is the mastermind. He is the Walrus. When the Beatles included the Little Nicola subscript of "No You're Not" underneath "I Am the Walrus," they immediately created a mystery as to who exactly is the Walrus. While the identity of the Walrus is in dispute until Lennon's song "God," it's made clear from the start that there are only two people from which to choose, Lennon or McCartney. George and Ringo are never hinted at being Tusk-worthy. The Walrus from Carroll's poem The Walrus and the Carpenter is the sly mastermind who leads a band of gullible oysters to a culinary demise. Taking into account Lennon's fondness for Carroll and the fact that almost all the credible Paul's Dead clues are found on John songs, it's easy to conclude that John plays the part of Carillion Walrus leading another credulous pack. Even Derek Taylor, Beatles publicist and personal friend of Lennon, was quoted as saying that putting secret messages in songs was just something that sly John Lennon might have done. Yet again, in one of Lewis Carroll's Alice books, there's a clear source of inspiration. In Chapter 2 of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, Alice is treading water in a pool of tears. Just then she heard something splashing about in the pool a little way off, and she swam nearer to make out what it was. At first, she thought it might be a walrus or a hippopotamus. After discovering the true identity of the walrus, the mystery is by no means over. Once the first riddle is solved, i.e., who is the walrus, John or Paul, a second riddle presents itself. Who is dead, the walrus, John, or the hippo, Paul? We are left like Alice with the conviction that something or someone has died. The Beatles Jabberwocky leads us to believe that the something is a band member, and the someone is Paul McCartney. So John is the walrus and mastermind who devours gullible fans, and Paul is the bloody hippo and mystery corpse, the magical mystical boy who gets beheaded by his bandmates. A final piece of the puzzle is one of the most notorious Paul's Dead clues, the 28th license plate on the cover of Abbey Road. This does appear to be a clue, but fans have misinterpreted it for decades. McCartney hadn't yet turned 28 in the summer of 1969 when the cover was photographed. On the other hand, John Lennon was 28 years old when Abbey Road was recorded, when the album cover was shot, August 8, 1969, and when the album was released, September 26, 1969 in the UK, October 1st, 1969 in the US. John was born on October 9th, 1940, so yet again, he was 28 when this iconic photo was shot. This creates a link between the white Volkswagen, often referred to as a bug, and the Beatle decked out in a white suit, John Lennon. And perhaps the very essence of the mystery is encoded in the Volkswagen license plate, the same way clues were encoded in Edgar Allan Poe's The Gold Bug. But in this case, it's the white bug. Aside from 28 if, there are other markings on the license plate. The letters LMW. L and M are likely to stand for Lennon and McCartney. After all, they were the songwriting team, Lennon/McCartney. What is W? Could it stand for Walrus? If so, it would be exposing the Jabberwocky to only the most astute fans. The W, Walrus, juxtaposed with L, Lennon, and M, McCartney. Who is the Walrus? Lennon or McCartney? Well, as we established, John is the Beatle in white, and who was 28 years old at the time, so yet again, this looks like confirmation that John was indeed the Walrus. Was the license plate John's personal signature? His way of revealing he was the mastermind behind the Jabberwocky, as the Beatles make their final bow on the Abbey Road cover. Paul, the barefoot corpse, and John, the Walrus, leading the way. And so on October 12th, 1969, after this final act is released to the public, an anonymous call is made to Detroit DJ Russell Gibb, and Paul's Dead hysteria is ignited. The Beatles Jabberwocky being their masterwork within their masterworks. A dream within a dream.